I had a horse farm that bordered a vast forest and river in East Texas. Didn't do much farming there. Some vegetables, mostly stabled and raised quarter horses. Anyway, I had 4 younger brothers and a neighbor that was a couple years older than me. This was the early 90s, and all we did was hunt those woods and mess around exploring all the time. We weren't supposed to cross the culvert of the river into private land, mostly because we weren't supposed to hunt there and our parents didn't want us getting into trouble. One day when I was 13, we stopped going there for a different reason. We were way deeper into that part of the forest than we were supposed to be. Further than we had ever been before, when one of my brothers noticed a pine thicket that had a bunch of trees, 14-footers, that were broken off at about 8 feet, and all laying pointed deeper into the woods. It was just a small stand of pines, but I'd say there were 24 trees all snapped off and pointed in the same direction. My first instinct when I saw those trees was absolute horror. I knew that wasn't natural, and I wanted the hell out of there. My neighbor was a complete psychopath. I always thought he had a death wish. He wanted to explore the timber that was across a small clearing where this abnormality was pointing. Something in me was screaming to get the hell out of there, but he and 2 of my younger brothers were determined to see what was beyond that small clearing. About the time we crossed into the clearing, we heard what sounded like someone coming through the woods where we had just been. At this point, I was completely terrified, and my neighbor and brothers were laughing at me, calling me a chicken and, just giving me absolute hell about it. When they walked back towards the pine thicket, I went wide and was taking a long way around back to the trail that would take me to where I wanted to be. My position, having backtracked, had me about 50 yards from them and that thicket, but I could see them. All of a sudden, I hear screaming. I see my neighbor come flying through the air and my brothers yelling and crying and heading my way. At first, I didn't see it, but after this thing, my God, it still unnerves me. This thing let out a scream that you felt more than you heard. It had to be 10 feet tall, human-looking and covered with jet black hair. At this point, we all were running for our lives, and this thing didn't give chase. We didn't think. We ran for what seemed like miles, and when we couldn't anymore, we all collapsed on the ground just on the line for our property. We were all hysterical, but this thing had picked my neighbor up and launched him 20 feet in the air. It broke his collarbone and everything. As we were composing ourselves, that damn scream came, and it was close. We never saw it again, but it got its point across. We never went back there again. We didn't tell our parents what happened until about 2 years ago. I'm 41 years old, and our neighbor to this day refuses to talk about it. We told our parents that he fell out of a tree, and we all got scared that day. What were we supposed to tell them? That a Sasquatch threw Jason like a baseball, and he broke his collarbone. Anyway, that's my buried trauma from childhood.
About 10 years ago, I was 20 years old at the time. Some of the teenagers from my church decided they were going to go drive down Ghost Road. This is a scenic gravel road in Hardin County, Texas, and it has a history. People who've driven the road have claimed to see a mystery light. The story everyone told me, however, is the little girl that would sometimes walk across the road. She would be dressed as a girl from the late 1800s would be dressed. Those who've seen her say that she walks across the road and stares at you. It takes about 40 minutes to get there from the town we lived in. And on a Saturday night in rural Texas, there's not much else to do for teens except do drugs, have sex, or chase ghosts. They asked me to go with them, but I told them I was too tired and would go next time. Little did they know my plan was to drive out there solo around 8 p.m. They weren't planning on getting there until 9:30, so I would hide in the tree line and scare the hell out of them. I arrived, parked my car on the side of the road, a few blocks away from the entrance of Ghost Road, the direction they wouldn't be coming from since my crappy car would have been noticed way too quickly, and walked about a quarter mile down the dirt road. I brought my multicolor laser pointer. I thought it would be fun to shine that light on the road at cars as they drove by. I climbed up into a tree and waited. I remember how cool it was outside that night. I can still feel the late summer breeze on my skin. The rustling of the trees was both calming and unnerving. I sat in the tree and waited for my prey to arrive. But after about 30 minutes, I started to hear sounds coming from the woods. The sounds were coming from behind me. and they sounded about 50 feet away. Leaves and brush crunching, twigs snapping. I shook it off as just animals rustling around in the woods. The sounds continued for another minute or two, and they were headed in my direction. I tried to be quiet, but since I assumed it was an animal, I didn't have any qualms about letting out a cough. Then I heard it, whispering. "Did you hear that?" Shh. My heart stopped. Who the hell was out in the forest? Why are there people wandering in the woods in the dark instead of driving down the road? Though I suppose I was technically doing that. I stayed as quiet as possible, and after a few moments of silence, I heard the indistinguishable sound of a shotgun being cocked. Next thing I know, loud shots start ringing out. I hear the shotgun ammo being unloaded as well as what sounded like handgun shots. I also heard some heavy country accents shouting, "We ain't afraid of you goddamn spirits. We know you're out here. Come on out." I was so scared that I felt like I was going to black out. I was sweating profusely, and the cool, refreshing summer breeze now turned cold as winter. I had no idea what direction those bullets were flying, and if they would end up coming towards me. After a few more minutes of hillbilly cursing and bullets flying, the sound stopped. A few minutes later, a big Chevy truck drove past, and they were flying down the gravel road, kicking up dust everywhere, which proliferated and got caught in my nose and throat, causing me to cough more. Thankfully, I was almost sure it was the same guys. After this happened, I decided not to go through with scaring the teens. I felt lucky to be alive. They could have easily been shooting in my direction. They could have kept walking towards me and maybe found me. There's no telling what could have happened. I climbed down and made a mad dash back to the car, because I didn't want to be seen by these guys if they decided to come back from the other direction. When I got home, I showered and went to bed. Of all the things I hoped to get spooked by on Ghost Road, guns being fired was not one of them. The next day, one of the kids called me and said that I missed out on all the fun, and told me how they stopped at the old cemetery down that road and ran around scaring each other and playing hide and seek. If only they knew. When I was younger, I never heard from my father all that much. He popped in and out of my life with a regular kind of irregularity, where he'd suddenly be married to some floozy one minute and divorced the next. About 7.5 years ago, when I was 13, he called us up out of the blue to tell us he'd been diagnosed with cancer and that he didn't have much longer to live. It was decided that I'd come and live with him for the last 6 months of his life, because he wanted to get to know me before he left. Well, he wasn't dying. That was a lie of his to get me down there. And for the first month of my stay at least, he was perfectly fine. He'd go off to work every day and leave me to my boredom in this shack of a house of his, in the middle of absolute nowhere. Whitney, Texas. Let me explain Whitney. Texas, for those of you who've never had the opportunity to drive through it. Whitney can barely be called a town. There are very few paved roads out there. Shopkeepers still keep a shotgun handy to ward off any young men who might want to get at their daughters, and inbred hillbillies still string dead possum carcasses onto their front doors. All there is of note is a high school and a few gas stations. All else is open fields, and desolate, empty-looking houses sitting alone in the swaying pasture. Our house was a converted trailer, surrounded by meth addicts who lived in other converted trailers. But they usually didn't bother you if you didn't bother them. Usually. So, one night, Dad stumbles his way to bed in a drunken stupor, as is common, and I stay up watching movies and writing. Around midnight, there's a knock at the front door. I'm dozing off in the armchair, and this sends me bolt upright. Did I just hear that, or was I dreaming? And then another knock. It didn't sound malicious. The movie was long since over, and had given way to the static that accompanied old VHS tapes. I got up and went to the door. "Yeah, who is it?" No answer. And then another knock. My hand started to feel icy on the handle. "I'm not opening the door till you tell me who you are." Another knock, 3 times. Then a whop on the glass panel in the middle of the door. I jumped back. There wasn't anyone out there that I could see. It was just darkness. I got up again and looked out, just to make sure. The same cold, penetrating, opaque darkness. Then a voice. A quaky, spittle-ridden voice. "If I see you, I'm going to cut your eyes out of your face, boy." There were no more knocks. I left Whitney 3 weeks after that incident.